Forget everything you have been spoon-fed about the special relationship between the United States and Britain because the history books have lied to you. They paint a picture of a polite handing over of the torch, a civilized transition of power between father and son. That is a myth designed to keep you sleeping. The truth is not a story of friendship. It is a story of ruthless survival, existential threats, and the violent mechanics of how one empire cannibalizes another to save its own skin. You are about to witness the exact moment the world changed, not on a battlefield with soldiers and cannons, but in a terrified cabinet meeting in London, where the masters of the known world realized they were no longer in charge. We are taught that power transitions are peaceful, but in 1895, the United States didn't ask for a seat at the table. It kicked the door down, shattered the lock, and held a loaded gun to the head of the British Empire. This forced a humiliation so deep, so absolute, that it was buried in diplomatic archives as a victory just to save face. This is the blueprint of a superpower collapse that happened overnight, a disaster the British elite never saw coming until the American knife was already pressed against their throat. To understand why this matters right now, why this is a warning for your life today, you have to understand the blinding arrogance of 1895. The British Empire wasn't just a country, it was the pink map, an unchallengeable leviathan that controlled the oceans, the global finance system, and the very concept of international law. London was the Rome of the modern world, the center of gravity for all human commerce. It was run by men like Lord Salisbury, a prime minister who viewed the world from the height of aristocracy, looking down on the United States as a chaotic, uncultured backwater of cowboys, robber barons, and unwashed immigrants. To them, America was a useful farm, a place to invest money and buy grain, but certainly not a peer. They believed the hierarchy of the world was set in stone by God and the Royal Navy. But while Britain was busy policing jungles in Africa, fighting tribes in India, and managing the slow decline of the Ottoman Empire, America had quietly mutated into a monster. The Civil War was over, the frontier was closed, and the factories of the North were burning hot, churning out steel and ships at a rate the world had never seen. There was a restless, angry energy in the American population. They were tired of being treated like a colony. They were rich, they were powerful, and they were demanding respect. The atmosphere in 1895 Washington was thick with resentment. The U.S. was suffering through the panic of 1893, a depression that had crushed the economy, and when a population is broke and angry, they look for an enemy. The American giant was awake, it was armed, and it was looking for a fight to prove it existed. The collision point wasn't a strategic port or a vital city. It was a useless mosquito-infested swamp in Venezuela that nobody cared about, until they found gold. This is how the trap always springs. Greed blinds the old empire to the danger of the new one. Britain did what empires always do. They drew a line on a map. They expanded their colony of British Guyana deep into Venezuelan territory, claiming the gold mines for the crown. It was a standard imperial land grab, the kind they had done 100 times in Africa without consequence. They called it the Schomburgk line, a border drawn by a British surveyor that conveniently swallowed up 30,000 square miles of sovereign territory. Venezuela, weak, bankrupt, and desperate, played its only card. It didn't send an army, it sent a plea. It screamed Monroe Doctrine and begged the United States to intervene. In any other era, London would have laughed. The Monroe Doctrine, the idea that the Americas were off limits to European powers, was seen in Europe as a cute American fantasy, unenforceable and irrelevant. Lord Salisbury dismissed the Venezuelan plea as the whining of a corrupt little state. He didn't even bother to read the intelligence reports coming out of Washington. He didn't see the political climate in the U.S. had shifted from isolationism to jingoism. He didn't see that the American president, Grover Cleveland, was a cornered animal looking for a way to unify his fractured country. Salisbury assumed the status quo would hold forever, because it always had. He was operating on the normalcy bias, the fatal belief that tomorrow will look like today. He was wrong. He was walking blindfolded into a buzzsaw, and the sound of the blade was about to deafen the world. The trap was set. The gold was the bait, and the British lion was about to step right onto the trigger of a loaded American shotgun. The fuse was lit not by a soldier, but by a lawyer. To understand the violence of what happened next, you have to look at the men holding the match. President Grover Cleveland was not a radical, but he was a man under siege. The U.S. economy was in the toilet, strikes were paralyzing the railways, and his political rivals were painting him as weak. He needed a distraction, and he needed it fast. Enter Richard Olney, his Secretary of State. Olney was not a diplomat, he was a corporate bulldog, a man who would spend his career breaking labor unions and twisting the law to serve power. He didn't speak the polite language of European courts, he spoke the language of ultimatums. When Venezuela begged for help, Olney didn't see a humanitarian crisis, he saw a weapon. He saw a chance to redefine the global pecking order with one stroke of a pen. Olney sat down and drafted a diplomatic note to the British government that remains one of the most aggressive documents in the history of international relations. It was known as the 20-inch gun note, and it wasn't a request for negotiation, it was an eviction notice served to the British Empire. In this letter, Olney stripped away all the niceties. He didn't ask Britain to reconsider the border, he told them they had no right to be there. But he went further. He dropped a rhetorical nuclear bomb that would shatter the British worldview. He wrote, "Today, the United States is practically sovereign on this continent, and its fiat is law upon the subjects to which it confines its interposition." Let those words sink into your bones. Fiat is law. It means because we say so. Olney was telling the most powerful empire in human history that on this side of the ocean, the law isn't what is written in treaties or decided by courts. The law is whatever the United States decides it is. It was a breathtaking assertion of dominance. He was effectively saying, your navy doesn't matter, your history doesn't matter, your queen doesn't matter. We are the masters here. He demanded that Britain submit the dispute to arbitration, essentially to let a third party decide if they could keep their own land, and he gave them a deadline. It was a slap in the face so loud it should have echoed across the Atlantic instantly. And here is where the disaster truly begins. Britain ignored it. Lord Salisbury, busy with real problems in Europe and Africa, treated the note like a bad joke. He read Olney's threat and dismissed it as crude American electioneering. He thought it was just bluster, a politician shouting to his base. The British Foreign Office, steeped in centuries of tradition, couldn't conceive that a nation with a navy a tenth the size of theirs would dare to issue a command. So, Salisbury did the most dangerous thing an empire can do. He hit the snooze button. He left the note on his desk, he went on vacation, he let the deadline pass. He waited 4 long months to reply, letting the silence fester in Washington, letting the insult boil in the blood of the American leadership. When Salisbury finally deigned to reply, he wrote 2 letters. They were masterpieces of condescension. He lectured the Americans on history, corrected their interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine like a schoolteacher scolding a child, and politely told them to mind their own business. He essentially said, the Monroe Doctrine is not international law, and we do not recognize your right to interfere. He thought that would be the end of it. He thought the Americans would read the superior logic of the British position, apologize, and go back to farming. He was suffering from the fatal arrogance of the old world. He didn't realize that in the 4 months he had waited, the mood in Washington had turned from irritation to homicidal rage. Cleveland received the British reply, and he didn't blink. He didn't call a cabinet meeting to discuss options. He went straight to his desk and wrote a message to Congress that was essentially a declaration of war. He told the world that since Britain refused to arbitrate, the United States would appoint its own commission to find the true border, and then he delivered the kill shot. He stated that once that line was drawn, it would be the duty of the United States to resist by every means in its power any attempt by Britain to hold territory past it. Every means in its power. There was no ambiguity. The President of the United States had just drawn a red line in the jungle and told the British Empire, "Cross this and we will kill you." The diplomatic game was over. The sleeping monster had woken up, and it was screaming for blood. When Grover Cleveland's message hit the chaotic floor of Congress, the reaction wasn't fear, it was an explosion of psychotic joy. The brotherhood of English-speaking peoples evaporated in a single afternoon. The House and Senate, usually gridlocked by partisan bickering, united instantly in a roar of approval. They voted unanimously to fund the Border Commission, effectively voting to fund the prelude to war. The news hit the streets of America like a hit of adrenaline. Newspapers printed headlines in inch-high type, screaming "War with England" and "Twist the lion's tail." The Irish-American population, millions strong and hating the British Crown with a generational fury, flooded the streets in celebration, demanding an invasion of Canada. Civil War veterans dusted off their uniforms. Militias began drilling in the parks of Chicago and New York. This wasn't a bluff. The American public was ready to burn the world down to prove they were a superpower. In London, the laughter stopped. The British cabinet woke up to the headlines and looked at the map with absolute horror. For the first time, they actually ran the numbers, and the math was terrifying. They realized that they had walked into a strategic kill box. Yes, on paper, the Royal Navy was the mistress of the seas, but ships cannot sail on land. The British realized that their prized possession, Canada, was a hostage. There was a 3,000-mile undefended border between Canada and the United States. The British Army, scattered across garrisons in India, Egypt, and South Africa, had no way to defend it. The Pentagon of the time had plans to pour hundreds of thousands of battle-hardened troops north, seizing Montreal and Vancouver within weeks. Britain would lose Canada, and there was nothing the Royal Navy could do about it. But the real nightmare wasn't military, it was financial. The modern world is not run by generals, it is run by bankers, and the bankers screaming the loudest were in the city of London. On Wall Street, the threat of war caused Black Friday. The stock market crashed violently. British investors who held billions of dollars in American railroad stocks and bonds watched their wealth vaporize in hours. They realized that if war came, the US would likely seize British assets or default on debts. The financial nervous system of the British Empire was tied directly to the American economy. The city of London stormed into the Prime Minister's office with a simple message: "You cannot fight the people who owe us money." The war would bankrupt Britain before the first shot was fired. The geopolitical trap tightened even further. Britain was not just facing America, she was facing the world. She was the weary Titan, staggering under the weight of global commitments. France was challenging her in Africa, Russia was threatening India, and then the final nail was hammered in by Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm II sent the Kruger telegram, a provocative message supporting the Boers in South Africa against British interests. Suddenly, Lord Salisbury saw the true shape of the disaster. If he sent the Royal Navy across the Atlantic to fight the Americans, the German High Seas Fleet would dominate the North Sea. He was facing a three-front war: Germany in Europe, Russia in Asia, and the United States in the Americas. It was checkmate. The empire was overstretched, isolated, and friendless. The panic in the British Admiralty was palpable. They realized that to fight America, they would have to abandon the Mediterranean and leave the Suez Canal vulnerable. The cost of pride was simply too high. The United States had chosen the perfect moment to strike, when the bully was distracted. The shockwave of this realization shattered the British psyche. For a century, they had been the predator. Now, for the first time, they were the prey. They looked at the angry industrial giant across the ocean, realizing that this wasn't a colony anymore. It was a rival that had already eclipsed them. The choice was brutal and binary. Fight for the honor of a jungle border and lose the empire in a global conflagration, or swallow the humiliation, kneel to the Americans, and survive to fight another day. They had to choose between being the master of the world or the survivor of it. The clock was ticking, the markets were bleeding, and the American militias were loading their rifles. In a moment that defined the entire 20th century, the British lion cowered. Lord Salisbury, the man who had laughed at the American note, the man who represented the dignity of the crown, made the only choice he had left. He blinked. The surrender wasn't announced with a white flag. It was dressed up in the polite language of diplomacy. But make no mistake, it was a capitulation. The British government announced that, upon further reflection, they would accept the American demand for arbitration. They agreed to let a commission effectively dictated by Washington decide the fate of British territory. They accepted that the Monroe Doctrine was real, not because it was written in law, but because the United States had the guns to enforce it. This surrender kicked off what historians call the Great Rapprochement, a fancy term for Britain kissing the ring. It wasn't a friendship, it was a strategic retreat. Britain began to systematically dismantle its presence in the Western Hemisphere. They pulled their capital ships out of the Caribbean. They abandoned their naval forts. They gave away the rights to build the Panama Canal, handing the strategic key of the oceans to the U.S. They outsourced the security of the Americas to Washington, effectively admitting, "We can no longer afford to be the master here, so we will settle for being the junior partner." They realized that to survive the rising threat of Germany, they needed America not as an enemy, but as an ally, even if that meant accepting a subservient role. The arbitration tribunal eventually meant, and in a final twist of irony, gave Britain most of the territory they had claimed anyway. But the dirt didn't matter. The gold didn't matter. What mattered was the precedent. Britain got the land, but America got the power. The psychological shift was permanent. The British elite spent the next few decades convincing themselves that this was all part of a grand plan, that they were guiding the younger Anglo-Saxon nation like a wise father. It was a comforting lie to mask their decline. The reality was stark. The 1895 crisis proved that the United States had the power to give orders to the world, and the world would obey. The center of gravity had crossed the Atlantic. This is the forgotten prequel to the modern world, the moment the torch was passed not with a handshake, but with a clenched fist. It teaches us the most terrifying lesson of history. Empires don't always die in flames and rubble. Sometimes they die in the quiet, terrifying realization that they can no longer afford to say no. Britain lost a continent without firing a shot, and in doing so, bought itself another 50 years of survival as a great power. But the clock was already ticking. They had admitted weakness, and in the game of empires, once you bleed, the sharks never stop circling. Today, you need to look at the world through the lens of 1895. As we watch new lines being drawn in the South China Sea, in Eastern Europe, and in the Middle East, as we watch new ultimatums being issued and ignored, ask yourself, are we watching a dispute, or are we watching the blink? We are living in a time where the established order is being tested by hungry, rising powers that feel the same anger and ambition that America felt in 1895. The debt is high, the military is overstretched, and the population is divided. The parallels are not just similar, they are screaming. We are watching the exits being closed. The soft default of inflation is the domestic surrender. The external surrender is the geopolitical retreats. Because when an empire blinks, the world you know doesn't just change, it ends in the blink of an eye. The British elite went to bed in 1895 thinking they ruled the world and woke up realizing they were tenants in an American building. Do not make the mistake of thinking your world is permanent. The transition has already begun. The only question left is when the next ultimatum is delivered, who will be the one to blink?